Hello and welcome to the IEEE Standards Association Privacy 101 series. In this series we're talking about privacy issues, personal data control, and we're really speaking about these issues for audiences of all types. We are taking questions via Twitter, and the hashtag is #IEEEPriv, so we hope that you can participate in this conversation. I'll also note that the session is being live recorded, so it will be accessible anytime for those of you who would like to pass along to your friends and watch later. Today we're focusing on the right to be forgotten. And if you've been tracking some of the policy and legislative issues around privacy and personal data, the right to be forgotten has come about from a case that was brought forward by a Spanish citizen who wanted to have some information removed from a Google search, information about himself. And this case actually culminated in a recommendation in 2012 from the European Commission that citizens should have a right to be forgotten online, and moved forward into 2014 when the European Commission Court says that Google must actually follow this concept of the right to be forgotten. Moving forward now, we are in the new world where right to be forgotten is meant to be respected within the European space. There have been many challenges. There are people who love this way forward, and people who also find it to be a challenge. So today we've brought together some experts who are going to share in this conversation with us about the right to be forgotten. Is it a privacy savior, or is it really an unworkable solution? And the experts we have with us today are Frederick Donk, who is the director of the Internet Society European Union Regional Bureau. We have John C. Havens, who is the founder of the Hackathon Project and author of Hacking Happiness. And we have Stephen Wilson, who is the vice president and principal analyst of Constellation Research. So these are three experts that are going to help talk us through some of the issues level around the right to be forgotten, what you need to know, and what some of the conversations that are evolving look like. So with that, I wanted to note that we have just under an hour today, and we will try to save some time for those Twitter questions at the end. So let's move right along, and what I'd like to do is ask each panelist to briefly introduce yourself. And then while you do that, and after you do that, I wanted you to please talk about you know, as we mentioned, the title for this session was The Right to be Forgotten, Privacy Savior, Unworkable Solution. We've really seen kind of people who are supporting the right to be forgotten and people who, for example, in a recent article in New Yorker magazine, Jules Polonetsky of the Future Privacy Forum actually stated that the right to be forgotten was one of the biggest mistakes that will go down in history for the European courts. So really, if the right to be forgotten was put in place as a way to protect or help people protect their privacy or their perception of privacy, we kind of find such fluctuation over if the solution is well-intended and misguided, or if it's a great solution, or perhaps one of the biggest mistakes and might actually hurt things like freedom of speech in the future. So will each of you please introduce yourself and kind of cover some of those high-level, your thoughts in that space, and maybe we could start with Frederick.
Thank you, Johnny. Hello, Frederick Donk speaking here. I hope you can hear me okay. Okay, just a brief introduction. I mean, the topic of today is really great, and I'm happy that you invite me to speak about that one. I mean, I'm Brussels-based. I'm the director of the European Bureau of the Internet Society. As the audience might know, the Internet Society has been founded 20 years ago by Vinton Cerf and Bob Kahn, by those we used to refer as the fathers of the Internet, and our mission is to promote an open Internet. We're also home to the IETF, which is the global standardization body. And we have 5 bureaus. Each bureau is the hub of ISOC activities, and I'm heading the European Bureau in Brussels. And as you can imagine, I've been exposed for several years to those conversations about the right to be forgotten, so I'm happy that I can contribute here too. Maybe let me start by maybe saying a bit what the European Court of Justice says and doesn't say. What I believe the European ruling does do is that they do not create or define or entrench a right to be forgotten. That they try to clarify that the European data protection law gives EU citizens the right to ask search engines providers to remove personal data from search results where the individual's right to privacy overrides the public interest. So it also makes clear that privacy trumps the economic interests of search engine providers. So now the real challenge will be the practical application of all of this and of the Court of Justice guidance in each instance when the individual seeks to have his or her personal data deleted or de-indexed, and whether or not a decision will need to be taken as it overrides public interest. So that will be really the big issue. Noting also that, well, I guess it was implicit in what you're saying, Johnny, that the content still exists. I mean, it's just the access to the content that will be removed. So that being said, I would like to pay tribute to someone who everybody knows, Peter Fleischer. I mean, it will be just my minute of marketing for Google. Peter Fleischer being the privacy officer of Google, who made on his personal blog a fairly good and coherent approach on what are the main issues of the right to be forgotten. I mean, if you take it sensu stricto on a very limited way, of course, everybody should be entitled to ask or request a web or a service or providers to remove data that he would have a place himself or herself. So that, I guess, is implicit for everybody. This is a contractual relationship. Now, the issue becomes a bit more complex if, for example, I post a picture of myself on Facebook and suddenly I realize that I don't like it anymore and then I want to remove it. Of course, Facebook should actually follow my request, but what if somebody else actually did take these pictures and post it on his or her blog? So we come to another level of complexity because it's just, again, the weight between privacy and somebody else freedom of expression. So it's a bit more philosophical, but it's just where we are. And of course, there are other level of complexity that Fleischer, again, described very well, and I would invite this audience to get and check on Fleischer personal blog. But again, privacy here is much more than defamation and libel. Privacy is also about what is true. So it's and I guess we will come back on that a bit later in this conversation. It's just about the behavior, just about the context and about the scope on people behavior. Now, to answer your question about the right to be forgotten, and whether it's good or not, or whether it's a bad decision or a good decision, well, let's be clear. There is no right to be forgotten, and there should be no right to be forgotten. There should be a right for privacy, and lawmakers should actually legislate, or could, or should, or might legislate for personal data to be deleted, but in no case they should legislate for personal data to be forgotten. So what we're talking about right now is that there should be a right to privacy that is effectively enforced, and that might require the deletion of personal data, or that might also prevent personal data to be shared from one purpose to another or unexpected purposes. So this is what we should be talking about. So I agree that the concept of right to be forgotten is actually something that is very confusing and should not be. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Frederick, for pulling some of those pieces apart, especially that the information does stay. So it's more about this idea that Google or search engines are a card catalog, and the power that they have as being this access to this information. So, so can I get some thoughts from you, John? Kind of a little introduction, your perspective. where you're coming from, and then your thought on, maybe it was good how Frederick kind of pulled it into I guess some points that we should think about what might be a little wrong with the right to be forgotten, even though the intent is well placed. What do you think about kind of, well placed, terrible solution, or perhaps use some work?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Joni, for having me. Real pleasure to be here, and really excited to be with the two other gentlemen on the call. I'm learning a lot already, so thank you. And I wish my accent was nearly as good as Frederick's. It's just not, so forgive me. My background, as Joni mentioned, I run a nonprofit. We also have a corporate arm called the Hackathon Project. And it's the combination of the word hackathon and happiness. And the logic is to rethink happiness or well-being. So instead of just being focused on mood, the logic is to use data, or passive sensor data, as well as surveys data, to help a person take actions where they knowingly will be able to then increase their well-being based on things like gratitude, etc. So I say all that as a background to say my interest in personal data is actually very, very personal. I think that a person's data is an asset. I think it's something they uniquely create into the ether, as it were. And whether it's a one small fractal of data as you go to a website and there's cookies that take aspects of that data, or there's a data situation with a Google or a Facebook or any organization where you sign a terms and conditions, etc. I think we're now getting more to the question at hand. I think we're within an existing internet economy, and I'll use this word, and maybe it's strong, but I believe it. I think it's somewhat broken, in the sense that I don't think it's nefarious. I don't think it started out of an evil place or what have you. I just think right now the balance of power or value when a person gives data is completely offset in terms of how that person then gains value for the services that are returned when they give. So I say all that to say I'm assuming the two other gentlemen on the phone, colleagues, I'll call you guys colleagues, if that's okay, have much more expertise around the actual laws governing, especially in the EU, about the right to be forgotten. I actually think the title for our talk today could be the right to have control, in the sense that if you think about asset as a physical asset, almost like specie or like currency, there's no question that if I had money, currency in some way, and wanted to take it to the bank and protect it in a way that I felt I should, and that was legal, of course, depending on where I was, that wouldn't be a question. I'd take my $100,000 US and put them in the bank, and after I pay the fees to the bank, that money is mine. Those are my assets. Any other laws, standards, philosophies, or practices to access that money, even if they are deemed legal, doesn't mean that they are correct or the best way to move forward. So I say all that to say that one thing that I'm very interested in as of late is something called personal data banks, or personal clouds. And this is a big part of, like, Doc Searle. He has a thing called VRM, which stands for Vendor Relationship Management. But the basic idea of personal clouds is that a person can control their data, and control in as much as they say, I will let this data be used for this purpose, and they can provide it where it's essentially sort of a P2P, peer-to-peer technical infrastructure, where when you agree with an organization or individual to share a piece of data, you share the data for the purpose you've stated what you're going to share that data for, and then the individual can even kill the data, as it were, press a button and have the data go away if they feel that the trust has been breached between them and the other organization or individual. So I say all this to say that this, first of all, philosophically is not, or I should say, is not exactly what we're talking about. So thank you for your patience in the sense of letting me go a little bit off topic in one sense. But in the other sense, I don't think it's off topic at all. I feel for Google in one sense. I like Google. I use their services. I have Gmail. But the fact is they are a corporate organization who, even according to their financial records, if you go to their page, they say they make the majority of their money from advertising revenue. So in terms of search, whether it's Google or any other search engine, If it's based on advertising revenue, then the underlying structure of how they get information is about data mining and profiling, etc. And the bias of those things makes it hard for me to think, as amazing as the search engines are, by the way, the bias is always going to be with the intent of getting to know people's behavior a lot of times before they even know it for themselves. And I think Google, Facebook, whoever has an amazing opportunity for innovation to say, look, you know what, we started the internet economy with advertising. We thought it was going to work. It works in these different ways, but we're Google, right? We're Google. Let's change this system and either charge people for the service or have a more transparent methodology of how people can exchange their data where they feel comfortable about sharing that data. Or else I think we're going to get to the point where whether it's the EU and there are privacy advocates who are really upset about the right to be forgotten, or people in the States who are just fed up with their data being, a lot of people think the data is being stolen. And if you go into the whole data broker industry, that's certainly hard not to feel that way. It's a multi-billion-dollar annual industry where we can't even get access to our data. We can't even see the data, let alone try to expunge it or change it. So we're in a place where I think it's going to be a race to the bottom for the companies who control this whole system if advertising stays as the primary revenue driving model. And I'm excited for the companies, the organizations that will say, hey, let's make as much money, let's build more transparency and more trust with our users, and let's create a new thing. I mean, just like Frederick just said, these amazing titans, who created the internet. Vint Cerf, who's a hero of mine, these are also people who can say, let's change the model, let's change the paradigm.
So this is really interesting. You remind me of Eve Mailer, a former Forrester analyst who calls privacy something that looks like user control, choice, consent, and respect for the user, these things. And these are systems that kind of exude privacy enablement. And so you've really picked on control, and I think, yes, there are kind of two things that we're talking about, which is the ownership of data, who owns data, the data that you put out there yourself as part of some system, or somebody else posting something about you which you might find as your data, which might be arguably your data, photos of you. Is that your data, or is that the data of the person who took the photo? So these are all really tricky questions, and also get into some of the aspects of identity management and how we actually are putting data into systems to begin with. But this whole concept of data control, it seems to be really key, and seems to also feed a bit into Frederick's points as well. So Steve, a little bit about yourself and your thoughts, kind of high-level overview for the right to be forgotten.
Yeah, thanks, Joni. I'm a technologist. I stumbled into privacy as the problem child of security some time ago. I've been with Constellation Research for about a year now, where I am the lead analyst for digital identity and privacy. And these issues obviously intersect, if not collide completely, in areas of big data, cloud, Internet of Things, mobility. And if you know Constellation Research, we're a disruptive technology analyst firm, and we're preoccupied with these sorts of issues. I come at privacy from the technology side, in fact from the identity management side. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've come to realize that obviously identity management is the problem of what do I need to know about somebody to do business with them, and privacy is exactly the inverse. It's about what do I not need to know about somebody to do business with them. And for me, this speaks of the issues of control, but moreover, it's about restraint. We'll come back to this. I think that control is a really problematic issue when it comes to personal data, but it's about restraint. If an organization knows me, if they have knowledge about me, then they should be restrained in what they do with that knowledge about me. And that plays into social issues of respect and exploitation, and exactly what the information economy is all about. So you're right that the right to be forgotten has aroused tremendous scorn I take Frederick's point that there is a misnomer here, and that control is a different thing from secrecy. The right to be forgotten sounds like censorship, it sounds like secrecy, and privacy is absolutely different. It's about restraint and control. So let's park that, and I'm afraid that we're stuck with the slogan, the right to be forgotten. I think that John makes a really interesting point too about innovation. This is tricky. It's not as tricky as people think, but it is tricky, and if anybody can work through these issues, you would think that Google, with its talents and its resources and its innovation, would be in a tremendous position to be able to work through and make a contribution. But we've got scorn, we've got a lot of game playing, we've got Google pushing back, and we've got some cynicism, especially on the American side of the Atlantic. And I'm confused by this. I think that the critics have looked at the right to be forgotten and expected perfection in the law, and all they see is problems. And I think that this is ironic, because technology is all about problems, right? Technologists know that there's no perfect technology, there's no perfect security, and so equally there's no perfect privacy. There are always going to be unintended consequences of technology and privacy, and in fact, I think that there are more unintended consequences of technology than privacy law. So I think that we need to be a bit more, modest. We need to be more forgiving. And I'll just make this point that, and I find that we're all agreeing on everything so far, so maybe this will stir things up a bit. But the unintended consequences of technology include things like the ability for criminals to use encryption. And as soon as a social conservative may complain about pornography online, or a police officer will complain about criminals using encryption, then the technologists say, hey, don't blame the technology, these are unintended consequences. And I think it's about time that we had the same sort of humility and the same modesty, right, when it comes to privacy and the law. Privacy principles have been with us for decades, and I find that they serve us really well. We get some weird combinations now, and the right to be forgotten bumps up against hyperconnectivity and the ubiquity of technology, and we wind up with some tricky issues. But we can work through these.
So, I'm going to stick with you and work back in the opposite direction, Stephen. This is your lucky day, because I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about how. But so in my role as technology evangelist for identity and trust for IEEE, one of the kind of areas that I have to straddle is this policy side of things and this technology side of policy side of solving problems and technology side of solving problems, and they overlap and they inform each other, but they are kind of a challenge to straddle between them. We've seen some of this with NIST recently, working towards a NIST report on the U.S. side of things about how to characterize what privacy engineering would look like. And so it seems that, even though we have great sets of principles, like, if you would reference something like the OECD privacy principles, there's been lots of work that's done in privacy space. We still kind of are not there. And I think you're absolutely right that the idea that things will be perfect is a flawed kind of approach, and that we have to take this step by step and start to fully understand some problems and work bit by bit. There are very few things that are perfect in the world across the board. So in that case, knowing that some of us have to speak with both the policy level but also at the engineering level, do you have some thoughts about what might be some strategies to start to work from further away from this idea of scorn, and that this was the most terrible mistake, and kind of towards a better solution? And like we've seen some things work around copyright. Copyright has been a place where removal of information has been successful, but we also see I think what Frederick brought up, that Google was really left to kind of make the judgment calls on when and how to make this happen, which is a big set of power for Google to have, and responsibility. So what about some thoughts on kind of tactically or strategically starting to move from from the kind of, hey, this is terrible space into something a little bit more positive and actionable.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about engineering for a second, because engineering is all about imperfection. You know, you can have the physics of flying cars, but engineering these things is difficult. Privacy is not perfect, and privacy is oversold. There's a whole lot of slogans going around about privacy is good for business, and let's just dismiss that right away. I mean, it's just childish. I remember when they said quality was good for business, right, in the 1990s, and quality in and of itself is not good for business. It's a slogan, and you need to get into what it's all about. So privacy, and this is a bit politically incorrect, but privacy creates tensions. Privacy needs to be thought of as just another set of requirements that are at odds with almost everything else that we're trying to do and make this. So, you know, think about security. We know that security is never perfect. We know that security is costly. We know that security can compete with usability, and it's the same with privacy. So let's not sugarcoat this. Let's understand that privacy competes with usability. It's actually privacy protective that you have to rekey your personal information all the time so that it's kept in silos. You know, privacy 101, that's actually a good thing. Cost, and privacy requires more effort. Let's think about opportunity cost. The biggest tension of all in privacy is that when you respect customer information, you actually withhold or you forego revenue opportunities. And we saw this recently with Apple. I mean, I have been critical of Apple, but I absolutely salute their new privacy statement. Tim Cook wrote an open letter where he said that our business model does not involve exploiting customer information. And so we know that there are billions of dollars to be made from exploiting customer information, and for a big company to say, look, that's a no-go area, we're going to restrain ourselves from reusing customer data, then I think that's a really big thing. And that's probably the biggest area of tension in privacy, is to say, look, we are going to forego the opportunity cost that might be there. So privacy engineering, I think, in practical terms, we need to surface some of the competing requirements and then reduce them to engineering informatics specifications. One way that, you know, security and privacy are problem cousins of each other. They've got a lot in common, but we know that they're different things. And we do a lot of work at Constellation trying to work out where these things actually touch and reinforce. So to think about that for 1 minute, we know in security there's no such thing as perfect security. It's all about unknowns. It's all about making some reasonable, informed estimates about what might go wrong and what the consequences might be. Okay, so engineers deal with the unknown all the time. It's therefore really ironic that when privacy lawyers come along, and for example, they will talk about identifiable information, I know dozens of engineers that push back and they say, come on, you need to define identifiable, we need to have some precision, we need to have certainty. Well, no guys, we don't. Your bread and butter as security engineers is to deal with the unknown. So, identifiability is a hell of a problem. We know that identifiability changes all the time. When we join up data sets, even IP addresses these days, and in Australia we're debating this. In Australia, we're now going to treat IP addresses effectively as personal information, because a big company can join it up and work out who an IP address relates to. This is not a bad thing. An engineer would look at this, or a security professional would look at this and say, look, why don't we think about risk and threat? And if the threat to the organization is that anonymous data becomes identifiable, it's just like the threat that any firms take the threat and risk assessment methodology that is tried and proven in security and play that out into privacy and start to treat the privacy of information as an asset. I completely agree with John. And then we should start to think about, you know, probabilistically, we should start to think about the threats, including re-identification, that harm those assets potentially, and then deal with it like we do any security problem.
So thanks for that. Steve, a lot of great ideas in terms of just going back to basics around engineering there, and this concept of, hey, you know, privacy is a complex issue, but we deal with complex issues all the time. So let's take it as another complex issue that we need to work through. So, so I wanted to ask John, with his perspective on personal data banks and sharing and so on. You know, do you really think that there's a lot of, do you have the same kind of negative view, or maybe not the same, but this negative view that we've talked about on right to be forgotten? Do you have kind of a more positive, optimistic outlook somewhere in the middle? What about, you know, tactically, some things that you've seen, John, strategically to get into a more workable space, or to improve the workability of right to be forgotten? John?
I mean, for me, you know, I'm both a journalist, right? Besides running the nonprofit, I'm an author, and I'm a contributing writer for Mashable, The Guardian, and Slate. So, you know, for years, I understand journalistic integrity, you know, objectivity, etc. So I can understand people's concerns, certainly with the right to be forgotten, and I would never want to mitigate their concern. For me, the reason I literally jumped with joy when I heard about the law was not that some people were suffering, but is the fact that the mindset and the paradigm, and I love so much of what Steve said. Hopefully I'll do justice to some of his points. But you know, if you get a chance, it was on Upworthy just this morning, but I'd seen it before. There's a wonderful TED Talk by a guy named Alessandro Acquisiti. Hopefully I'm pronouncing his name right. Acquisti. And he gives this step-by-step sense in terms of engineering of how Facebook, photos on Facebook, and there's millions, I forget what the number is, but millions of people's facially recognizable photos on Facebook who aren't even on Facebook. They are not members of Facebook, but you can see their picture, you can circle it with that little square, and he shows how easy it is to identify. He did a study at Carnegie Mellon, identify with now pretty simple, readily available technology, people's faces, their identity rather, with like at least a 50 or 60% accuracy, and it's improving by leaps and bounds, you know, daily. And then how easy it is in the States to go from that name to a social security number. And I think Facebook also, I will pick on Facebook a little here. It's a great service. I use it. But they came out with facial recognition as opt-out. Okay? So from a paradigm standpoint and an engineering standpoint, what that meant was people could post pictures of however they like to post pictures. And this isn't, you know, a lot of times I tell people privacy is a preference. I'm not going to tell someone they shouldn't put pictures up of their kids online, except that my concerns about facial recognition, I'll tell them. But the logic here is that Facebook made a decision for millions and millions of people. They enabled a technology that would let other, and all that information is used for advertising. Same thing with Google with something like Street View. They're still, you know, dealing with court cases with Street View. The logic there was not about taking pictures and videos of the world, and that's another awesome service. It's beautiful to look at. But is the idea that they admitted to in court that they accessed unencrypted Wi-Fi data and took the data for their own. And whether it was a one engineer, that whole theory, et cetera, all that is to say it embodies a philosophy that has a pragmatic and an engineering side to it, where it isn't just like a mistake, right? It's not like, oh, like I give credit to Mark Zuckerberg and Google. I don't think these came out with opt-in, et cetera. So all that is to say that we're having this whole discussion within an existing paradigm that is here. And I'm living here. I'm trying to create a future where the paradigm is not me having to worry about Google because of a paradigm that now just has become pervasive in the past 10 years. A 10-year-old business model focused on advertising, as much as it may be helping a lot of people in one sense, does not circumvent what I think are the core rights for a human to protect the data about who they are. And I think something like Street View is a great example. Driving by my house And the fact that I haven't encrypted my Wi-Fi means that I don't technologically know how to encrypt my Wi-Fi. Doesn't make me stupid, just means I don't know how to do that. So taking that data, whatever excuse, wiretapping all this stuff, it's another conversation. I call it theft. If I walked into your house and took information of yours, you know, or if I walked in front of your house and videotaped your house, you'd call the cops. All this stuff, and again, this sounds like I'm demonizing Google, and in one sense I am, but I'm not demonizing how smart they are or the awesomeness of their services. But that means all of this paradigm of, did Google make tough choices? You know, they were put in this position of power. The answer is, of course. They're the ones controlling that power. And in terms of their vision for controlling the world's information, or organizing the world's information, really organizing in the word control can be switched, right? And if you talk about algorithmic bias, about how people's data comes to the surface and how it's organized and all that type of stuff, long story short, to Steve's last point, and to get pragmatic, Joni, to your question, I will call on Google and Facebook. These are amazing services with the resources. You know, Facebook is the world's third largest country. Why can't we have a place where I might pay for your services? A, it's a lot easier and faster than a lot of advertising revenue models. B, there's tons of data showing that when someone trusts an organization with their exchange of their data, they give much more granular data. And this is like, you know, what Apple is now doing with their health app, to Steve's point, right? You hook up your jawbone and you give passive data. Great, have access to my passive data. And then on top of all that, I just wrote about this for a piece for Mashable, a lot of data broker data, which is where a lot of the data about us that is, you know, taken from us is sold, is erroneous. And it's not minor stuff. It's not like my hair is black instead of brown with gray. It's I'm a woman versus a guy, or I live in Kansas versus New Jersey. So I think the massive opportunity for innovation is for these companies to say, how can we, like the law with the right to be forgotten, have a person be able to have more access to their data and have conversations around what might be accurate. But at the end of the day, it's still my asset. I get tired and passionate, as you can see, about why is it that I have to work so hard to protect what I believe is inherently my own.
Yeah. So, and we had another one of these hangouts too, where we talked about things like I think we called it privacy-free economies, and we'll talk a little bit more about this point that Steve made earlier too, around, you know, privacy being good or bad for business. But I think you know, what I'm hearing from you, John, is really that these organizations that have kind of risen to the top in the last 10 years should be challenged. And if anything, at least the right to be forgotten puts kind of an aspirational stake in the ground to try to start moving that paradigm in another direction, knowing that we know that it's not perfect, but it's that stake in the ground that perhaps gives that kind of that we can aspire to. So so let me ask Frederick, being perhaps the one closest to the ground as far as how things are developing within the European Union, what you're seeing over in that jurisdiction, you know, do you kind of see the same positive and negative perceptions, and do you see any kind of momentum maybe on the policy or technology side to identifying some of the things that may be improved around right to be forgotten? What's your view, Frederick, for improving?
Well, thank you, Johnny. Those are many questions actually, and well, I'll try to answer some of those. I'd like to build a little bit of what I heard from Steve and John on what might be, and by the way, the conversation about the right to be forgotten is maybe just prompt this kind of conversation, which is good. And what it is privacy, what it is that we understand being privacy. People should not forget that privacy is about sharing information. It's not secrecy, as you said, Steve. It's not about secrecy or anonymity. It's just about sharing information that you select, and you share it in a specific context. And this is where the context is important. You might remember this case of this famous case of Stacy Snyder, this lady, young lady, who actually posted a picture of herself 6 or 7 years ago, making her the first victim of a privacy hostile kind of approach. And she posted a picture of herself on Flickr with a hat and holding a plastic glass, and the picture says "the drunken parrot." And this picture of her, and she was studying in university to just become a teacher, was suddenly on the desk of the dean of the university, who decided that she should be fired because the picture was clearly an incentive for young kids to drink alcohol. So what I'm trying to say is that it's just really a question of context, and there might be legislation about the context that actually you don't use something from one context and you try to export it in another context. So I believe there's much to say about that. There's much to say about the expectation. So people know, understand, and I guess policymakers as well understand that there is also an expectation in privacy, and privacy is about a transaction on the internet between A and B and the information that you share. So there are stuff that you would do publicly and the stuff that you would do privately, and those are different, and you need to realize and, well, to just go within this. So what the bottom line here is, let's not try to make, even if the wording is a bit, it's not something I would agree with, right to be forgotten, but let's not make it more ridiculous than it sounds in reality, and that it is in reality. I mean, this is the first time that I see in a legislation an attempt to make sure that the users has some control about his own data, which is something good, per se. Of course, there might be a lot of unintended consequence of this, and we still need to discuss this. So we are currently discussing this in Europe. As you know, the Working Party, Article 29, just sent Google some guidelines about how they should proceed about privacy. At least there are a conversation now which is more concrete about how users could actually be in control of their data, which is, I believe, a good way. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you, Frederick. And I wanted to make note as well that if people are watching live and wanted to tweet some questions, they can tweet hashtag IEEE PRIV, PRIV, and we'll try to get to those toward the end. So, I think this is important about the concept that, the words around right to be forgotten may not have been exactly the kind of the best words to capture. But being the first legislation, it seems that it's also certainly had some effect. I mean, there is apparently in 2015, California is meant to put into action this, what they're calling an eraser law, which is meant to enforce that content providers will remove any information that's posted by a minor. Now, how will that actually occur? This is still, I'm not sure how the functionality, how they'll be able to prove that someone was a minor and then take that information down. So, this is a really interesting space. And in addition, we've seen things like even the Canadian anti-spam law, which now, technically, by the words of the law, if you as a mother email the class to say that, Johnny or Susie has a baseball glove for sale or a soccer ball, now you violated the Canadian spam law because you didn't identify yourself, people didn't opt into that message. So the legislation component is very much a challenge, and I think it's very good to see that that at least there's kind of attempts that are happening, and we're probably early on in that space as far as kind of how to legislate. And I do think that it's admirable for the that the European Union has really tried to take that leap, and so we will see evolution in that space, and legislating technology is a challenge in itself, and luckily we have many good people working on that, and engineers as well connecting to those conversations. So, in addition to the kind of legislative side of things, I wanted to also kind of maybe take a moment to get back to this idea around to something that you know, Steve touched on a little bit when he said, you know, privacy is good for business or quality is good for business. Indeed, they are slogans. We have seen that privacy breaches or breaches of personal data, which could also be security breaches, is bad for business. You know, but we're also seeing lots of new kind of things coming up where, you know, Google and Apple trying to encrypt so deeply that they can't even gain access to the information. And we've seen hails from the more privacy advocate side of communities, and then we've seen criticism from law enforcement and others as to, you know, what kind of problem this is going to cause. So we're seeing companies that are starting to potentially move into that direction, and it may also be a case of the nice exhaust of having encryption that's so heavy that you can't even gain access as a service provider, as now you're not liable for that information now that you can't gain access to it. So we're seeing other things happening, like the recently viral ELLO social network, which is to stand itself up on this idea that they will never sell your personal data. They will try to have a new business model, and there are tons of criticisms in that space in terms of, you know, things that they lack, and eventually they will sell it. And so there's all kinds of conversations happening now. So, you know, I'm wondering, I've kind of had this belief personally that we would get to a place where privacy would be like a value added for some sort of service, and that's a choice. I think John, you know, said it, privacy is a preference, and it's a choice that you would make. And so the balance between how protected should I be, for example, when I drive a car that I know it's been tested, that it doesn't have any big, you know, flaws that are going to kill me, versus, you know, being able to make some preferences and choices about, you know, what I share, when I share, and have some control in that space. So, you know, in terms of right to be forgotten, legislation, technology, I'm wondering from the panel, do you kind of have some views on, you know, do you think that we will get to a place where privacy-enhancing technologies or pets will become part of something that a consumer customer looks for, or they will be something that is built in, maybe from a government to citizen perspective? Do you think that privacy will be something like a value-added service, and do you see things kind of coming in that direction? Frederick, you should go first.
Am I on mute? Yes, I am. Well, it's a really good question, actually, because you got services that suggest, well, take XQuick or DuckDuckGo suggest that there might be a market for privacy-friendly search engines. Team Drive suggests that there is a market, or there might be a market for cloud-based secure storage. I mean, Team Drive insists that their servers are located in Germany, not in the US. So there are a lot of well, services and providers that suggest that there might be something like that emerging, and you just mentioned hello. I'm on it. I'm trying to use it, see how it works. It looks great. We are not the product. They say I might be tempted to challenge this a little bit, but this is not the point of this conversation. But what I'm trying to say is that privacy-enhancing technologies that should not just be as good as existing services with just this little bit of privacy more. There is a whole ecosystem which is privacy hostile. So what we're talking about here, I guess, is how those privacy-enhanced technologies-based services could actually displace incumbent competition, which is based on a very strong economic ecosystem that fund it. And this ecosystem is privacy hostile. So that's happening, and I believe this is the level where we should have this conversation. And then to just finish, well, there are many people who are that privacy-enhanced technologies will succeed if the market will choose them. And I have some doubt about that, because it would also mean that people have clarity or full transparency or well informed to make that choice, which I believe they don't at the present stage. So I know it's opened many more conversational thought, but this is what I would like to inject at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick. So I wanted to ask Steve, you know, you kind of, I think, helped tip that off a little bit with coming back to, you know, privacy is good for business and things like concepts of this nature. So, you know, if we're looking at things from the right to be forgotten perspective and then also regulatory and then kind of the overlap or interplay between public and private, what are your thoughts on, you know, is there with your analyst hat, are we moving into a direction, maybe more of a value add or a liability protection, or, you know, really are we kind of left with are we more at, like, let's say, the mercy of the momentum of the tides of the organizations that are pushing this forward today?
Yeah, look, I think momentum is a good word, and I think that we need to be patient. You know, some of these problems are quite new, and they're going to take some time to play out. I think that privacy as a value add is not the right. I think that it's almost defeatist, or it as a value add, you know, it literally suggests that the baseline is no privacy, and we're going to go forward. I literally think that I would like to see a value subtract. And I'm not playing word games so much as just acknowledging again that Apple, for example, has said we are going to restrain ourselves from exploiting information. There are temptations out there that we, Apple, are going to resist, and that's what privacy is all about. Privacy is about restraint. It's more about what you don't do than what you do, and therefore it's really not a technology issue. We talk about technology, you know, overtaking privacy. Well, it's a category error. Most of the privacy-enhancing technologies that we see are actually secrecy-enhancing technologies. You know, Tor, DuckDuckGo, PGP. And don't get me wrong, encryption is important, and we should encrypt by default. There's no doubt. It's a scandal that we don't. But we need to be careful what we ask for. If you encrypt everything, you only get secrecy. You don't get the ability to live and move and transact and trade in a free and respectful way. We don't want to live our lives in secret, right? So I think that going underground is a really bad response to privacy. Response to the privacy problems that we have. You know, we've got business models. John's been very articulate about the problems of the business models, and Frederick talks about the ecosystem. Our correct response to these things has got to be political. We should be advocating for political change. If we don't like what governments are doing as revealed by Snowden, then you don't go around encrypting. You can't use encryption to defeat the NSA. You have to use politics. We need to have a community movement. We need to agitate. We need to advocate, and we need to vote with our feet. We should be using systems like LO if that appeals to you. Fantastic response to the Facebook paradigm, and let's hope that they start to see some support for that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So in line with your point on politics, and I'll note that we have 5 minutes left for total response to the question that we've gotten from Twitter, and then we'll be wrapping things up today. So we did get one question, which was about, you know, how does the kind of right to be forgotten bend or address in terms of the different role that the person who would be, you know, being forgotten, the different role that they play in society. So how does it affect whether you're a politician versus a criminal versus a celebrity or a private citizen? You know, I've seen one article pointed out that there's someone who got out of jail 30 years ago, has committed no crime since, but has a harder time finding a job now than he did 30 years ago when he got out of jail because of the pervasiveness of data and accessibility of it. So I wanted to actually ask Frederick your thoughts on kind of the right to be forgotten approach and how it kind of, just an overview and how it varies depending on the role that the person being forgotten is playing in society.
Well, this is an excellent question, and I believe societies actually request that sometimes public interest overrides privacy of some individuals, and might be the case of criminals or for politicians. And yes, this is, as Steve said, this is a policy discussion. It's nothing to do with technology. It's important that we have this conversation at policy level and that we agree on the societal level that there might be public interest overriding privacy. So it's just about contravention or court judgment and sentences. So this kind of stuff. So yes, I mean, I wanted to say something else, I just forgot now. So yes, there is a balance, and the balance needs to be taken by. I believe here in Europe we need to understand that it's not a commercial entity that should take the final decision about that. It should not be Google who should decide about this and who should override what. So it should be a court, it should be a tribunal, it should be the public interest that should be taken into account by public authority. So that should be also some main conclusion here about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Frederick. It is a big responsibility to kind of determine how that balance works, to put that in the hands of the service provider. And kind of the politics of the role that you're playing, and how that should feed in with right to be forgotten. John?
Well, just quickly, there's been some legislation in the states of interest. There was one called a bill called SB 38, I think it was, with a senator in California where one of his constituents, a woman, came and she was being stalked on a regular basis. Because one of the available data is it's very simple to get financial data, and it's very simple to find out, for instance, where a young woman lives. And these two gentlemen kept stalking this woman. And she said to the senator, who was a friend of her dad or something, "Can I see my data? Can I have access to that data and be able to expunge it?" And long story short, I won't bore you with all the details, but the senator, even just trying to get this bill passed, he only had 2 hours on one day to allow lobbyists to come in and give them their position on this. And he had over 35 lobbyists from all the major tech companies coming in saying why they felt this was such an important deal. I think the thing about this whole conversation, and I'm just going to wrap up because I know we're at 3 minutes or whatever, is to say thank you. I've learned a ton, so thank you, Joni and IEEE and Frederick and Steve. It's been a real pleasure to learn from all of you. But I think my closing thing is I'm so excited that we're in the beginning of this paradigm where I know I may sound like I'm demonizing these companies. That's never my point. My point is to say that something that started back here, it's time to evolve, and we have this chance for innovation. But our data, at the end of the day, a lot of the whole focus of companies who are trying to access our data is to essentially know more about us than we know about ourselves. And I think the danger there is that from a sense of building well-being, we have to be able to access our data so we can use it not just for financial and transactional purposes, but to know how it can enhance our lives. And if we can access it and build insights that other people have that we don't, then that's a fundamental human issue, not just a privacy issue. And the last thing I'll say is Steve made a great point about the language. It's not just semantics. For me, saying, are there privacy-enhancing technologies, it's sort of the analogy of a car. It's like saying, do you want a car with an engine or not? Because right now the whole internet is driven, and this is to Frederick's point too, it is privacy adverse. So I don't want to answer that question. I don't think I need to answer that question legally, morally, or any other way. My data is mine. I get to control it. I understand that's a tough thing to say right now. I'm not anti-Google. I'm not anti-Facebook. Evolve, guys. It's time to innovate. You're the ones to do it.
Thank you so much. So as we're wrapping up here, I wanted to give the floor to Steve if you had a minute or less on final comments, and then I will be wrapping up. Steve, any final comments?
I might say something about the right to be forgotten and Google. These are really tricky issues, and we need to be quite clear about what we're asking Google to do. Google has invested billions of dollars in just the most fabulous piece of machinery that we could not live without. Search is transformative. And it's made them a lot of money, and I respect that. But if it's so transformative, and if there are unintended consequences, then we should expect Google to participate in sorting out what those unintended consequences are. It's not about censorship. It's not about going back in time and erasing anything, but it's saying that if this magic machine, it's a magic spyglass, it's just like Arthur C. Clarke said, right? It is magic because it's so sophisticated. And if search can drag things out that are otherwise invisible, right? Search allows us to see things that you can't find in any other way. Then there must be some responsibility for the consequences of that. And it's not about secrecy or censorship. It's about filtering. And you know, the whole purpose of search is to filter. And I think what goes with that, the flip side is that there should be some sort of negative filtering in response to the privacy problems. So I think it's a very reasonable position that the European Court has taken.
Thank you so much, Steve. So I would also kind of leave it with something around that is very important to us at the IEEE Standards Association, which is the open stand, which is all about collaboration, working together, and I think everyone coming to the table, all the stakeholders, is key. So I wanted to thank each of our panelists. Thank you so much for bringing so much to this conversation. Thank you to those of you who are watching online and will watch in the future, and thank you very much to the IEEE Standards Association for producing this event today. We look forward to the next event moving into 2015. We will also be digging deeper into these issues with the Privacy 201 series. So thanks for joining us, and we wish you a great rest of your day or evening wherever you may be. Thank you.